Hello everyone, we are Group 5 and we will be presenting Chapter 7 Typology. I'm Marcella and I'm going to be the first presenter for our group. So, let's go! In this chapter, we will begin by describing the morphological systems of 5 very different languages, looking at the kinds of lexeme formation and inflection that they display. Then, we will discuss both traditional ways of classifying the morphology of languages and more contemporary ways of doing so. Finally, we will look at how both the family a language belongs to and the geographic area in which it is spoken can influence its typological classification. So, these are the main focuses in this chapter. Next, let's see the list of key terms in this chapter, which are isolating, analytic, agglutinative, fusional, polysynthetic, index of synthesis, index of fusion, index of exponents, head marking, dependent marking, and lastly, implicational universal. Please do take note of these key terms mentioned in the chapter. Now, let's proceed to 7.1 Introduction. So far, we have learned formal processes of morphology that occur in many languages of the world. We have provided a sort of toolkit for forming new words from which languages can pick and choose. But we have yet to see what we call the big picture. Later on, we will look at how languages exploit different parts of our toolkit to constitute their own unique systems of morphology. Also, to acknowledge that we can compare languages to each other to see if characteristics of their morphological systems correlate in any way with other parts of their grammars, for instance, their syntax or their phonology. And we can look at the distribution of morphological patterns in terms of language families or where languages are spoken in the world. Basically, studying language from this sort of global perspective is called linguistic typology. 7.2 Universals and Particulars, a bit of linguistic history. Linguists began researching indigenous languages of Africa, Asia, and North America more seriously at the turn of the 20th century, partially as a legacy of colonialism. So, what is universals and particulars? Let me explain a bit or so to give you a vision regarding it. Particular, as we know, is defined as an individual thing around us. Let's say language is a particular. The essence of language, like what a language is, have an interesting quality to it. It is a form or essence, but it is applicable to more than one particular. What a language is, or its form, is applicable to this or that language. Because the form of essence are applicable to many, they are called universals. A universal is a term applicable to more than one particular thing. Universals and particulars are both important. We can only begin to confront the problem of universals until we have a sense of the full range of particulars. That is why it's so important to learn the widest variety of languages possible. 7.3 The Genius of Languages. What's in your toolkit? Students of linguistics often have a sense of excitement when they come open data from languages they never heard of before, and discover how very different languages can look from one another. The linguist Edward Sapir, writing at the turn of the 20th century, had a rather romantic name for the unique combination of processes that characterized the grammar of each language. He called it the genius of the language. Sapir's idea of genius comes close to that feeling that students have that the new languages they encounter are in some sense new creatures. In this section, we take a brief look at five very different languages, which are Turkish, Mandarin Chinese, Samoan, Latin, and Nishnabangin.
So that's all for me today. Now let's move on to the next presenter.
Assalamualaikum and hello everyone. My name is Wafa Rosmiwanti Irwan and I will be presenting the Genius of Languages, which consists of Turkish, Mandarin Chinese, and Samoan. We will see the combination of morphological processes that constitutes in these languages. So let's begin. First and foremost, we will look at the suffixation and compounding in Turkish. To begin with, do you know the translation of this sentence only consists of one word? Here it is. Czechoslovakia lelaştıramayacaklarmış dan Medeneş. What a long word. I spent the whole night just to pronounce it correctly. Anyways, this may seem very unlikely, but it is possible because Turkish is a language that delights in suffixation. There are 11 suffixes in this word, which are li, lash, tir, ama, yachak, lar, imiş, dan, mi, yidi, and nish. Each of these suffixes has its own function and roles in order to form a new and complex word. Next is compounding in Turkish. There are two types of compounding in this language, which are noun plus noun and adjective plus noun. For noun plus noun, baş means head, bakan means minister, so başbakan is prime minister. For adjective plus noun, kirk means 40, ayak means foot, so kirkayak is centipede. Overall, Turkish only relies on suffixes and has no processes of prefixation. The only prefixes that can be found in Turkish are always borrowed words that are not a part of the native system. Moving on to the Mandarin Chinese, a Sino-Tibetan language. In this language, we'll go through the suffixation, reduplication, and compounding. Almost similar to Turkish, Mandarin also has no processes of prefixation to speak of, and it has only a tiny handful of suffixes. Let's see the examples. The suffix shui means a study of something, while dongwu is animal. So when it compounded, it will be dongwu shui, which means zoology. Suffix jia makes personal pronouns, and keshui means science. So keshui jia means scientist. Mandarin also has full reduplication, which it uses for two purposes. Verbs can be reduplicated by adding a little to form derived verbs. In the example shown, jiao means teach, jiao jiao means teach a little. Some adjectives can be reduplicated to make intensive adjectives that means very. Pang means fat, so pang pang means very fat. Mandarin is also incredibly rich in compounding, and these are some of the examples. The next language is Samoan, an Austronesian language. We will see the process of prefixation, suffixation, circumfixation, compounding, and reduplication. What makes Samoan interesting contrast to Turkish and Mandarin is that it uses a wide variety of word formation processes without seeming to favor one another. Let's see the examples of Samoan prefixation. The prefix fa'a can be put on either verbs or nouns to make verbs meaning put something on. As an example, masima means salt, so fa'a masima means put salt on. For suffixation, suffix ga forms abstract nouns from verbs like ao means learn, which is a verb, aoga means education, which is a noun. For circumfixation, fe'ai is a reciprocal and it means each other or one another. For instance, mata means look, so femataai means look at one another. The process of reduplication in Samoan take verbs and make them into frequentatives that forms repeatedly. Aa means kick. Aa means kick repeatedly. Finally, Samoan also has compounding, which is facsimile, which means piece of soap. This word is a combination of the word fuzzy, which means piece of, and soap, which means moly. So that's all from me. Let's see more examples of morphological processes in other languages which are Latin and Nishna Bemuin that will be presented by my friend Valencia. Thank you and goodbye everyone.
Hi guys, how are you doing? I hope all of you are in the pink of health. Hence, before I start with today's lecture, I would like to firstly introduce myself. My name is Valencia Dikumanganak Padusudin and welcome to Miss Valence class. I hope that you guys will be able to understand on what I'm trying to deliver today. Let's get started. Therefore, in today's lesson, I'll be teaching on 3 subtopics, which are genus of language for Latin, Nishna Benwim, and the summary for this topic. First of all, we will be discussing on genus of language for Latin. So what is it mean by genus of language of Latin? Like Turkish and unlike Mandarin and Samoan, Latin is a heavily inflected language. However, its inflection looks rather different from Turkish inflection because several meanings are combined into a single inflectional morpheme in Latin. You will probably recognize elements of Latin derivational morphology, as many of them have been borrowed into English. Latin nouns are inflected for case, number, and gender, while adjectives are inflected to agree with them. Each inflection carries a combination of meanings that includes the case, number, and gender. Verbs have a number of different stems which form the basics of inflectional paradigm. It shows aspects such as imperfect versus perfect, voice such as active versus passive, person and a number as well. These verb forms are built on one of the stem forms called the theme vowel stem to which a future suffix "b" or a perfect suffix "b" is attached. For example, in Latin affixes, there are 2 types of affixes. First one is for non-past, or in English we call it as present tense. Suffix "o" is added to singular verbs while "imus" is added to the verbs to produce plural verbs. While for past tense, suffix "I" is added to verb while "imus" is added to plural verb. For derivational suffix and prefixes, abstract nouns are formed from verb roots by adding the suffix "or." The suffix "man" attached to either roots of or theme vowel stem to form nouns that denote the result of an action. We are now moved to another genus of language which is Nishna Benwim. To be frank, this is my first time hearing this language. Let us dive into the language, shall we? Nishna Benwim makes a heavy use of affixation, especially suffixation, and has an extremely rich system of inflection. Bound morphemes are combined to form new lexemes. Nouns are either animate or inanimate gender. It can be inflected for a number and have different forms for diminutive, pejorative, and contemplative. Contemplative is a suffix that adds a negative meaning but is less strongly negative than the pejorative suffix. Nouns can also be in a locative form and obviative form. Noun inflection, on the other hand, there are prefixes and suffixes that indicate position of a noun. For example, Zishibak. These inflections are not mutually exclusive. Verb inflection, the independent form of the verb, is used in main clauses and indifferently inflected forms are used in subordinate clauses and in imperative. By polarities, verbs have different forms for positive and negative. English uses the same forms of the verbs in main and subordinate clauses and uses separate word for negation. Derivational words are rarely consist of a single root morpheme. Various bound morphemes are joined together to form words. Intransitive verbs frequently consist of 2 or 3 pieces. For example, the first piece is called the initial, which expresses something that modifies the verbal concept. Verbs may also have a third piece that occurs between the initial and the final is called medial. Valentine uses terms like initial, medial, and final rather than calling the vowel morphemes that make up this form prefixes or suffixes. This is because these morphemes are much more like roots rather than like affixes in their meaning. Compounds in Nishnabemwim are being composed by two independent stems. Presentation. So, to sum up on today's lesson, we now know that what is meant by genus of language. Next, by studying morphology, it helps to open our eyes to different mixture and balance of word formation process to be found in individual language. Thank you for listening, and now we will move to the next presenter.
Hello everyone, my name is Nur Fateha Som, and today I'm going to be presenting Chapter 7.4, Ways of Characterizing Languages. Our first question is why? Why do we need to classify languages? We classify languages in order to look for particular sorts of traits that cluster together into one category. We also do it to see if those clusters can tell us something deeper about the nature of the language. There are several methods to classify the morphology of a language, such as the fourfold classification, the indexes of synthesis, fusional, and exponents, head versus dependent marking, and the last one, correlations. I will be presenting on the first two methods. Fourfold classification is a traditional method developed by a linguist named Edward Sapir. It is divided into four morphological types, which is isolating, agglutinative, fusional, and polysynthetic. Isolating or analytic languages are languages in which each word consists of one and only one morpheme. For example, Vietnamese, where plurality, tense, and aspects are all expressed by separate words. For example, Tong Ho, which means watch or watches. If we need to know specifically how many watches there are, we need to add a numeral followed by the classifier. Hai Kai Tong Ho, which means two watches. Agglutinative languages that have complex words but is easily segmented into separate morphemes where each morpheme carries a single meaning. For example, the Turkish noun for house or ev. To make it plural, we add the morpheme ler. So, for example, the genitive plural is evlerin. In this, two sorts of morphemes are easily separated. Fusional languages are not easily segmented as several meanings may be packed into each morpheme. For example, Latin, where it's not possible to separate morphemes that means plural and another that means genitive. Girl in Latin is puel, so we can assume that the morpheme for genitive singular is e, making it puelle, and the genitive plural is arum, making it puellerum. But there is no way of separating parts of these morphemes into smaller pieces. Lastly, the polysynthetic language, where words are mostly extremely complex, morphemes are expressed with different lexemes and have different meanings, such as the Nishnabemwin language that has an inflectional system and can form complex words out of two or more bound morphemes. For example, the word gajigna, that means have a sore head. These forms can then act as basis for all the inflectional affixes that attach to intransitive verbs. The issue about the fourfold classification method is that languages rarely fall neatly into only one of these four classes. But no worries, we have another way of characterizing languages, which is the indexes of synthesis, fusion, and exponents. First off is index of synthesis that looks at how many morphemes there are per word in languages. For example, isolating languages have a few or one morpheme per word, whereas agglutinative and polysynthetic languages have many morphemes per word. Next is index of fusion that measures the degree to which morphemes are phonologically separable from their bases. Languages with low degree of fusion are more clear, such as isolating and agglutinative languages, whereas languages with high degree of fusion are less clear. Last but not least, index of exponents that measures how many meanings or inflectional features can be expressed simultaneously in a single morpheme of a language.
That's a wrap on my part of the presentation. Thank you so much for listening. I'm sorry for any mistakes, and I'm especially sorry for the chicken noises in the background. I think it's time for me to change them into fried chicken. Excuse me while I go do that, and allow me to pass you on to the next presenter.
Hello everyone, my name is Vanessa Anapute, and I will be explaining about the subtopic head versus depending marking and subtopic correlation. There are other things you can look at, however, in classifying and comparing languages. One thing we can look at is the way that morphology signals the relationship between words and phrases. The main element in each synthetic phrase is called its head. The other elements that combine with the head to become a phrase might be called the dependence of the head. The main element in each synthetic phrase is called its head, whether it is a noun phrase or verb phrase. Meanwhile, the dependence could be broken down into two categories, which is the dependence of noun and the dependence of verb. Furthermore, the dependence of noun could be broken into three categories, which are adjectives, determiners, and possessive. The dependence of verb could be broken down into subject or object. Languages can choose to mark relationships between the head and its dependents in different ways. The relationships can be marked exclusively on the head, or exclusively on the dependent, or on both, or neither. If the relationship is marked by some morpheme on the dependent, this is called dependent marking, and if it is marked on the head, it is called head marking. On the other hand, it is possible for a language to have inflectional markings on both the heads and its dependents. This is called as double marking. We will look into the example in English language. The first example is John cheat. The relationship has been marked exclusively on the head, which is John. John is the noun, thus the head marking is being marked on the noun phrase. Another example is these houses. The relationship has been marked exclusively on the dependent, which is this. This is a possessive determinant, thus it is the dependent marking. Another example of the dependence marking in verb is with he. The subject is with and the object is he. Let us see another example from Hungarian language. Es ember haza, the main house. The relationship has been marked exclusively on the. The is the dependent determinant, thus it is a dependent marking. As I mentioned earlier, it is also possible for languages to show neither head marking nor dependent marking. For example, a language that is isolating and has no inflection would have neither head nor dependent marking. On the other hand, it is possible for a language to have inflectional markings on both the head and its dependents. Typologists are interested to find whether there are any patterns to the kinds of morphology one finds in a language, and if there are any, why those patterns might exist. Whaley points out isolating languages usually have rigidly fixed word order. This correlation makes perfect sense. Another example is Joseph Greenberg noted two patterns. First, if a language has inflection, it will also have derivation. If a language has word morphemes for number and case, and if both are either prefixes or suffixes, the number morpheme almost always occur close to the base than the case morpheme. But we observe a statistically significant trend in the ordering of inflectional affixes in the languages of the world, claims that the order of inflectional morphemes on verb has something to do with their relevance to the verb itself. The second of Greenberg implicational universes might be explained in the same way. Number is an inherent inflection on nouns, but case is contextual and inherent marking comes closer to the noun stem than contextual marking. Whether this is generally the case, however, is something that will require looking at many more languages. That's all from me. We'll move to the next presenter.
Hello everyone, my name is Regina Binti Kadimon and I'm going to present about genetic and areal tendencies. There are two ways to classify languages on the basis of specific structural characteristics that they display in their morphologies. The first way is we may look at whether there are sorts of morphology that tend to be prevalent in particular language families or subfamilies. The second way is we may look at whether there are specific sorts of morphology that tend to be found in certain geographic areas, even among languages that belong to different language families. There are a few examples of genetic tendencies. For example, if we look at the compounding into different branches of Indo-European family, which are Italic and Germanic. In Germanic languages like English, tend to favor endocentric attributive and subordinate compounds. For instance, for endocentric attributive are dog-bed and windmill, and for endocentric subordinate are dishwasher and handmaid. Meanwhile, Italic languages seems to prefer exocentric subordinate compounds. For example, the word lavapiatti. Lava in Italian language means wash, and piatti means dishes, so together it will form dishwasher. Now, let's move on to areal tendencies. There are three languages spoken in close proximity in the Balkan region of Europe. They all mark the definiteness of nouns by adding a suffix. Definite nouns refer to any specific person, thing, or an animal. The word the is a definite article. For example, in Albanian, the word mik means friend, and u is the suffix, so it literally means the friend. For Bulgarian, the word trup means body, and ad is the suffix, so it means the body. Lastly, for Romanian, the word om means man, and the suffix ul is added, so it means the man. Another example of a morphological pattern that is especially prevalent in a particular geographic region is verbal compounding. In Chapter 3, we learned that English rarely compounds two verbs, but in Asia it is not at all unusual. For example, in Japanese language, the word nakisaken means cry and scream. Naki means cry and saken means scream. In Mandarin, the word mai dao means manage to buy. Mai means buy and dao means arrive. Next, I will explain to you about the typological change. Languages change over time. Their typological characteristics can change as well. For example, in English language, Old English had a far more complex inflectional system than modern English does, with grammatical gender, agreement between determiners, adjectives and nouns, and a far more extensive system of verb inflection. By Middle English, much of this system had been lost. In typological terms, English has changed from being fusional and synthetic to being isolating or analytic. In conclusion, in this chapter, my group members and I have explained that we have surveyed 5 languages to see what morphological resources they make use of. Turkish is an agglutinative language that largely relies on suffixing. Mandarin Chinese is an inflectionally isolating language that makes heavy use of compounding to form new lexemes. Samoan makes use of a wide range of different word formation processes to derive new lexemes, but poor in inflection. Latin has heavily fusional inflection and primarily derives new lexemes using prefixes and suffixes, while Nishna-Burman is a polysynthetic language. We also look at the traditional fourfold morphological classification of languages into isolating, agglutinative, fusional, and polysynthetic types. And we learn useful typological tools such as the indexes of synthesis, fusion, and exponents. Lastly, we look briefly at genetic and areal tendencies in morphological patterning. That's all from us. Thank you for your attention.